Have you ever heard a story so dark, so buried beneath layers of myth and religious triumph, that its mere whisper could shatter the grand narrative of holy wars? Not the tales of noble knights or papal blessings. No, this is a story soaked in desperation, deceit, and blood. A crusade not led by kings or knights, but by peasants, fanatics, and false prophets. A march not towards glory, but towards annihilation. This is not the First Crusade, you know. This is the one the Church does not commemorate, the one the chroniclers dismissed as folly, and the one that ended in a massacre so brutal, it was almost erased from history. This is the forgotten massacre of the People's Crusade. In the spring of 1096, as Pope Urban II's fiery call echoed across Christendom, thousands responded. Not just nobles or warriors, but farmers, beggars, women, and children. They were promised salvation, eternal glory, and the cleansing of sin through the spilling of infidel blood. But what they received was betrayal, starvation, and death. They were led not by trained commanders, but by a man named Peter the Hermit, a monk of questionable charisma and even more questionable leadership. He preached to the common folk, igniting a fire of religious fervor among the unarmed and the ill-prepared. They called themselves pilgrims, but they were convinced they were crusaders, and so they marched, not with banners of empires, but with rags, crosses, and blind faith. Tens of thousands, maybe more, crossed into Eastern Europe with no plan, no supplies, and no discipline. And as they moved, chaos followed. In the towns of the Rhineland, some turned their fury not against Muslims, but against the Jewish communities of Europe. Entire villages were slaughtered. Men, women, and children. The so-called army of God became a mob of butchers, and no one stopped them. As they moved into Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios I was horrified. This was not the disciplined Western army he expected. This was a mob of hungry, ragged zealots, pillaging his lands and threatening his people. He quickly arranged ships to ferry them across the Bosphorus, more out of desperation to rid himself of them than to aid their cause. On the other side of the strait, in Anatolia, they met the real enemy. The Seljuk Turks were experienced warriors, hardened by decades of war. They watched the approach of the People's Crusade with amusement. What they saw was not an army, but a moving target. And they waited. Peter the Hermit, for reasons still debated by historians, left his people shortly after they arrived in Turkish territory. He returned to Constantinople, perhaps to beg for aid. He would later claim he had gone to seek reinforcements. But the truth? He left them to die. The army split into factions. Some marched deeper into Turkish territory. Others looted nearby towns. One group, led by a German named Reinald, attacked the Turkish-held town of Xerigordon and captured it. It was a bold, foolish move, and it sealed their fate. The Turks surrounded the town. They cut off the water supply. What followed was a siege of thirst and horror. Crusaders drank the blood of their horses, even their own urine, to survive. After days of suffering, they surrendered. Most were executed. The rest sold into slavery. The massacre had begun. The remainder of the People's Crusade, unaware of what had happened at Xerigordon, continued to march blindly into the ambush laid by Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum. On October 21, 1096, near the town of Civetot, the trap was sprung. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The Turks surrounded the camp. They struck at dawn. Arrows rained down. The untrained crusaders scattered in panic. Some tried to fight. Most ran. Few escaped. The forest paths were littered with bodies. The ravines filled with the dying. Blood flowed through the hills of Anatolia like a river. Out of the estimated 20,000 to 40,000 who set out, only a few thousand survived. Some were taken prisoner. Some managed to flee back to Constantinople. Most were never seen again. And Peter the Hermit? He returned to find the army he had raised gone, erased. He would later join the main Crusader force and even witness the siege of Antioch. But he never spoke much of Civetot. And the church, it never honored the dead. There were no songs sung for the peasants. No relics kept of their sacrifice. No shrines or holy days. They were forgotten. not because their faith was lesser, but because their story was inconvenient. The People's Crusade doesn't fit the glorious narrative of Christian victory. It exposes the darker truth, that the Crusades were not always about noble causes or divine destiny. They were also about manipulation, about using the faith of the desperate, about sending the poor to die first. In many ways, the People's Crusade was a test run, a blood-soaked prelude to the wars that followed, a reminder that in the shadow of every holy war are the bones of those who were never meant to survive it. So the next time you hear tales of the First Crusade, of knights in shining armor, of holy cities, of God's will, remember the forgotten march. Remember the peasants who believed they were chosen. Remember Civetot. Not all crusaders wore armor. Not all martyrs die with glory. Some are swallowed by silence. And their story is the one we must never forget.